Hi and welcome back to the next video. In this video we want to finish what we started in the first video. There we made a Docker file for the Spring Boot starter template. And in this video here we want to make a docker-compose file where we also run and connect the Postgres database to our Java Spring Boot. And we want to have also Postgres adminer, so we have a UI or a port that we can visit with the browser where we can manage everything in the database. So we want to connect Spring Boot to our database, and we want to make some simple post and get requests to Spring Boot and save this data in the database. So what we need, at first follow the first video, and then you can follow this video here. And like in the first video, you need Java, Maven, Docker, Spring Initializer, and then we can start. So the first thing, I have open here two windows because Visual Studio Code for me only works good with Java if I open this in the repository in one window directly. So you can see here this is just one above where I have the README and where we will later add the Docker-compose file. And here this is the directory Spring Boot Dockerized, so this is this folder here. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to add some dependencies to our POM. So the first dependency that we need will be the data-jpa, because we want to save some data, do something with it. So we just simply add our group ID, org Spring Framework boot. And we want to have our artifact ID, which is a Spring Boot starter data-jpa. And then we need our database. So we need to do another dependency. We want to use here Postgres database. So we go for the package org Postgres SQL, and then the artifact ID is the Postgres SQL. And then we can specify the scope, and this should be a runtime. So if we run the application, we want to go against this database. And another dependency that we want to add is lombok, so that we don't, if we make a model, and we don't have to make all the getters and setters, and we spare some time there. So the group ID here is org.project lombok. The artifact ID is lombok. And the version that we want to use is 1.18.8. And the scope is provided. So now we can go on. Or one thing that we also need to do is, this will be our database for runtime, but so that the tests that run, if we, for example, build the whole application, are successful, we need to connect also to a database. And herefore we could add an internal H2 database. So we can add this very simply as group ID. We choose H2 database. We say H2, and the scope should just be the test scope. Then we can go into our folder here for Java, and then we can make another folder that we can just call model. And in this we want to make a new model. So we want to save some data with our Spring Boot API. So we could make a user model that we want to save to the database later. So users, for example. So we can just call it user.java. So we have here our public class user. And so we can annotate this with add data from lombok. So when we don't need to do any setters or getters, we can use add entity from Java persistence. And we can also say the table should be named, let's say, users. We also have to import this. And then we can say, what do we have? To make it very simple, we have a private ID and we have a private string name. And we can annotate the ID with add ID from Java and also make it a generated value from Java X persistence, and can, for example, say the strategy to do this is the generation type auto. So then we have our very simple user model. So we just need later to send the name to the database and the ID will be auto-generated. So the next thing that we need is the repository. So we can add a new folder here. We say repository, and then we can make a new file. And we can simply say this is the user repository.java. And this is not the class, but should be an interface, so we can access it. And here we can very simple extend the JPA repository so that we have all the methods. And here we say we want to go against our user model, and then we have our long integer. So to work, we have to annotate it with add repository, and then we can save it and we can use it. And the next thing that we want to use or want to make is our user service. So we make a new folder service, and then we say we have our user service.java, which is just a public class, and we can annotate this with add service. And here we first need to inject our user repository, so we can say private user repository is the user repository, and we can say we want to auto-wire it. And then we just have two functions, one that is returning all the users that are in the database, so that we can return this for our GET request that we make later. And we want to make one function where we add a new user, so a username, and make it very simple. So we could say, for example, we want to return a public, a list from the type user, and we can just say find all, and for this we return very simple our user repository dot find all, and we have to import this, and then we have another function where we want to return or where we want to add a user. So we say we want to add a user, and this is from type user. And then we simply return our user repository dot save and flush, and here we give it the user. So the next thing that we need is now our endpoint. So we need a controller. So we can add here another folder and call it controller. And can make here another file that we say UserController.java. And here we want to also make a public class. And we want to annotate this with addressed controller from Spring Framework Web. And we also want to do some request mapping, and here for the endpoint /users. So when we have like localhost 8080/users, whatever we do, and we can very simple get our users. And here we need also a dependency. We need our user service. And then we will or want to have two endpoints. The first should list all users and the second should add one user. So we can say public, then we have a list for user, and we want to find all. And here we can very simple return our user service dot find all that we just made, and we have to import our list. And we also want to have a function to add a user, so, or an endpoint to add a user. So we say public user and then we call it add, and then we want to access, for example, the request body from this request, and we say there is a user and this is what we want to add. So here we can say return user service dot add and give it the user. And then for these two endpoints to work, we have to annotate them. So this here should be a simple get request, so we can say get mapping, and this here is a simple post mapping. So this here is listening for get request on /users, and this here is listening for post request on /users. So we could replace this with a DTO or poach or whatever, but for now we don't need to do this. So now we have our Spring Boot application that is having like our model, our controller. So we have to move this here and change this to controller. And then this should be all that we need here. Now we can start by making our Docker file. And then if we have made our Docker file, we have to add here in our resource, our application properties, all the stuff that we need. For example, the connection to the database and so on, but this will be environment variables that we create first in our Docker-compose file. So we can now go here and we can add here on the top of the project a new file that we call docker-compose.yml. And then we have our configuration file, and we want to say at first this has a special version that we want to use is 3.8. And then we can specify the services that we want to have here. So the first could be, for example, we want to have our Postgres database. So for example, we can here make here a little comment and say Postgres database, and then add the service. So we can say we want to name it Postgres, and then we say we want to rely on the image from Postgres that is available on Docker Hub, and this could be version 10.4. So you could always go to Docker Hub. 1 second, where is it? For example here, and you can always search for images. And so right now I'm using 1 second, from Postgres version 10.4. So you can go to this image or to this hub for Postgres and then choose or look in the text what you need. So I want to use 10.4, and then I want to make some ports mapping. So we have here the outside port that should be available to us, and the inside port of Postgres is always, or the port of Postgres is always 5432. This is the standard port for Postgres. So with this port, this will be the port that's available inside the Docker container, and this port is for the outside. So I will later add here a little graphic at the end of the video where I will explain how is the communication working inside and outside of the container. So here we have our ports, and then the next that we want to set is the environment variables. So this is called environment, and here we can just specify everything that we need, and you can look this up in the Postgres documentation. So there are some specified environment variables that you can set. So this is like Postgres password, Postgres user. And so we need to give or set these environment variables so that everything will work or that we can connect later. And so we could, for example, say the Postgres user that we want to have is very simple, the user. Then we have our Postgres password, which is just password. And then we have at least our Postgres database name, so Postgres_database, which will just be DB. So this should be all for the Postgres database. Then we can, for example, add our dependency for the postgres-admin. If we choose or if we search for this, you can see postgres-admin. This is just an admin. Let's see how it's called in English. Is a tool for managing the content in a database, and so we can also get there an image. So we want to use, or we can name this, for example, Postgres_admin. Here we also want to rely on an image, and this is, let's look it up. I don't know it exactly. Let's search for Docker Postgres-admin. Let's see where it is, Postgres-admin. So I think for Postgres it is pgAdmin or something like this. Yeah, exactly. This is the Postgres tool that we should use. So we can search for pgAdmin Docker, and then we can see pgAdmin container. And now we have to go to the Docker Hub. Where is it? So here. And then we can, for example, go to the tags. And then we go for example for DB page, pgAdmin in version 4.28. And we can just copy and paste this to here. So this is the image that we want to use for the Postgres adminer or for the pgAdmin. Then we can specify, for example, this depends on our Postgres service. So we name this here exactly like it's named here. Because if we want to connect to the database, it should be there. Then we have our environment variables. That's the same like for Postgres. We have to specify the standard login things like it's specified in the documentation. And this is pgAdmin _ default _ email. And we can very simply set this to admin@admin.de. And then we need another environment variable. This is the password. So this is pgAdmin default password. And we simply call this password. And we also need to add here some ports. So we say, like before, the standard port of the DB admin or for Postgres is 80. So we can say we want to have our outside port 5050, or 50,050, where it's reachable for us here. If we open it later here, we will, because we are outside of the Docker container, we can just access as a local host 5050. But inside, we have to map this port to port 80 inside our Docker container. So now is coming the most important part. We here want to add our, let's say, API Spring Boot. And this is our API. We can call the service whatever we want. And then we say, we want to build, because we don't have an image at the moment. And this should be built from Docker file. And the name of this Docker file is Dockerfile. And then now we have to specify one path. So we want to go into this folder here. So we give it a context. And this context should be we are here in our folder. Then we go into our Spring Boot Dockerized folder. So we go into Spring Boot Dockerized and then a slash, because in this folder here you can see here is our Docker file that we want to use to build everything. Then we can say this will depend on a service, and this is also our Postgres service. And then we can specify some environment variables that we will need to add in our Spring Boot application, so that this Spring Boot application will connect to our Postgres database. So the first thing that we want to use or that we need is our database URL. And this is Postgres SQL. 2 dots, whatever it's in English. And then we say this is also for Postgres. And then we go for port 5432. So what we have here in our Postgres database for this port, because we are inside our container. And we want to go against the database DB. Then we need to specify our database user. So we say user, and this is the user that we have specified here. And the database password is the password that we specified above here. This is also password. And then last, we want to make it also accessible from the outside of the world. So we say here we have also ports, and we want to access it over port 8080 from the outside, and the inside port is 3100, like we specified here in our resources, in our application.properties. So now we have our file, and now we have to go into our application.properties and add this here. So I will just go into this here. So now we are in our application.properties and have to add here all the properties that we need. So the first thing is we need to give our application a data source. So we say spring.dataSource .driver minus class name, because we want to go with the org.postgres_sql driver. The second thing is the spring.dataSource initialization mode. We always want to initialize everything. Then we want to say in what platform are we, so we can say spring data source .platform, and this is Postgres. One second, what did it do? Postgres. So the next thing that we want to add is our spring.dataSource URL. Datasource.url, so where we connect against the database, and this is our JDBC, and then we add the database URL that we created here in our docker-compose file as environment variable, so we can just access this database URL. So we make here $, and just add it like this as an environment property in my environment variable. And the same goes for spring.dataSource.user name. Is it okay? It's username. Then we just go against our environment variable that we added. So we say database_user. And the same goes for our password. So we go against datasource.password, and we just say database password. So this is the environment variables that we added in our docker-compose file. Then we need to do some JPA stuff. So we can say spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl auto, and we want to do this with update. So we also want to update this schema if possible, or edit. Then we want also to show the SQL that we that is generated. So we can say show SQL. and set this to true. And then we can say spring.jpa properties hibernate dialect, and this will be org.hibernate dialect postgres. Oh, 1 second. Postgres SQL dialect. And the last thing that we need to set is the spring.jpa properties hibernate jdbc lob non contextual creation, and we set this to true. And then we can start just to run our container. So then we can just go to our parent here. And now we are here in this folder here, and we can just execute our docker-compose. So we could, for example, say docker-compose, make it build, so that we build the containers or the images that we need. So now you can see we get the Maven, we execute everything. Now we have to wait. Because at first time it has to download all the dependencies, especially from Docker Hub. You can see it here now. It has to get all the stuff from Maven, all the dependencies for our Spring Boot application that we are using. So this can take quite a while, so don't worry. Just make it a little bigger. And then we should see that it's going through all the steps that we specified here in our docker-compose and in our Docker file. So right now we are in our Docker file and we are downloading all the dependencies. And then we will make a clean package. And now you see we have a test error. So we are not able to find in our controller to find the class user. And I think I moved the class controller, so we are not able to find the user. So I have to import it here. And now it should work. So we can save it. We can go back and we can execute the command again. And you see now it skipped all downloading the images because the images are already here on my computer or in my Docker. And now it's building again our application. So from our Docker file here, and it's downloading all the dependencies. And then it will make a clean package. And if there's another error, we have to check. So probably I think we can get an error that there's a test failure because it will try to connect to the Postgres database. But in this stage, the Postgres database will not be available because it hasn't been started here because we are just making the build command. So it's not able to connect the database, and so there will be a test failure. But we already added the POM in the POM the H2 database, so we can make in our test folder later a configuration that it connects to the H2 database. So you can see it here now. I think there were some errors. So we can go to the top. What did it say? And here you can say could not obtain connection to query metadata to the JDBC URL. It's not working. So for example, we should now go into our Java, so in our backend, and now you see we have here a test package, and which is running the test, and this is just because there's nothing specified. But what we can do here is we should add on the same layer here, we should add a resources folder for our test package. So I have to write it correctly. resources, because Spring Boot will pick this up automatically. And here we need a file application.properties, and this will be used automatically if there's something inside if you run the test. So we have to set this also up here, spring.dataSource.url, and then we can use the standard URL for H2 database. So this is also JDBC. Then we go for h2.mem, and the standard database for H2 is the testDB. Then we need another Spring data source, the username and password, and we can also go with the standards here. So the username is the SA for H2, and the standard password is empty, so we can just make it empty. And then we can, for example, if you want, we can disable the H2 console. So we say it's not enabled, so we say false. And we can also say we want to show the SQL. We can say, like before, our spring.jpa.hibernate getAll auto set to update. So it's always checking the schema. And we want to make spring.jpa.hibernate properties.format SQL also to true. So it's formatted correctly, and now we can run it again, our Docker file. So we go again to the Docker here, to our Docker file, and we run the build command again. And now you see we are now again in our Docker file and downloading all the dependencies, and then we will run the clean package, which is also running the test phase for Spring Boot. And so now in the test, by running the test part, it should not try to connect to our Postgres database because it's not running here. It's just running if we later say docker-compose up and start all our services. And here it should now connect to our internal database, to the H2 database, and then everything should be correctly. So you can see now Spring Boot is starting here, and now it should try to connect to our H2 database. Let's see where it was. 1 second, where are we? So here's our Spring log. And you can see now everything worked fine. So we had a H2 dialect and connected to our database and made the statement create table users with the ID, the name, and the primary key as the ID. And started also a sequence with Hibernate for everything. So you can see tests run 1, failure 0, error 0, and skipped 0. And everything here was successfully. So we can now say we want docker compose run up, I mean. And now it has to pull some images again. Just give it some time. And we can also look. Now if we hit against the postman 8080 users, there's coming nothing because the application is not up. But if this went correctly, we should be able to post a user here or to get a user. And we can also make a request here later to localhost 8080 because this is the outside port. And there we should get returned a hello world. And here, if we go for 8080/users, we should get returned at first an empty array. And then later, if we added some users, we should get returned here all the users. So let's wait till this here is there. So now we can, for example, make it run here again. And now you can see here localhost 8080 hello docker world. And if we now go against localhost 8080/users, you have seen we get an empty array because we didn't add any users so far. So we can now, for example, make a simple post request to this URL here. And in the body, we just specify the name of the user. So for example, Thomas. We send this and we get in return our user. So he's now having the ID 1 and the name Thomas. Now we can say and add another one with the name Oliver. We also get this returned. We can make here the simple get request, and now you see we get in return two users as JSON, which would be like here an array and then two users specified. We still get here the hello Docker world. So everything correctly, and we could now also connect to the Postgres database with the postgres-admin. So we can go to localhost on port 5050, the port that we specified here for the postgres-admin 5050. You can see here, now we have to add the email that we added in our docker-compose file, and we'll type in the password, and we click on login. So now we want to add a server, so we can very simple go to servers, add a new server here. Then we say, let's say it's our P3 server, whatever we want to name it. Our host is of course Postgres. Our port is 5432, like we specified in our docker-compose file. The main database is DB, like we said it here. So we have DB, we have our port here, like we said it here, our internal port from in Docker, and we have user password DB. So what we have to check is here, this is not, the username is not admin, but it's user, and the password is password. And so we can save it, and now you see we have here our P3 server. We have our databases, for example, and then we can also look for some data and so on. So we have here our DB, because this is where the Postgres user and everything is lying, and here we have our DB that we are using inside with our Spring Boot application. So let's see where our tables are. Our tables are here. We can see we have our user table. And I think we can, for example, just, so now you see nothing is happening here. And if I make here a request, then we should have here like somewhere in transaction. We can also run some SQL, I think. No, where can we run it? Query tool. So we could say, for example, and we say here run, and then you can see now we have all the 3 users within the database at the moment. So at last, let's make some simple drawing what is happening with all the ports. So for example, we are here on our host. So let's say this here is our host machine. So for example, my Windows, whatever. And then we have here our Docker stuff. And so here would be somewhere, I would be somewhere around here and want to query something with my browser. So I kind of, whatever I use, Firefox. And then in our Docker, we have 3 things running. This is first our Spring Boot application. Then we have our P3 database, and we have our pgAdmin. And you remember this here was listening on port inside for 5432. Spring Boot was listening, I think, on port 3100, and pgAdmin on port 80, like we specified in our docker-compose files. And we have here, like the outside port for Spring Boot was 8080. So this I can access with my Firefox, and then this is mapping to this port here. So here we have like our interface, and then if I want to post the user, when I do this to here, to this port, then this is going to here, and then Spring Boot is connected internally between to port 5432 where postgres is lying, and this here is also internally. And then if I post the user here to 8080, then this gets into Spring Boot and this saves it to the Postgres database, and I could also access the Postgres database here from the port that we specified in our Docker-compose. So I think it was 5500, whatever I did, I don't know. And then we have here for the pgAdmin, what we just saw is the port 5050. And this is going to here, to this interface to access it. So like this here is the inside ports in Docker, and this here are the ports that I mapped them to in my Docker-compose file.